your questions now, and so many on the issue of those atrocities. And we'll start with Dee in a moment. Just to let you know, Professor Michael Clarke's going to be, our security and defence analyst, is going to be answering those, as many of them as we can, for you. But Dee asking about these alleged atrocities, asking what so many people are thinking, Michael. What can the West do to halt the killing of innocent civilians? Well, I mean, that takes in what we've talked about before about intervention, no-fly zones. What can be done?
Directly, nothing. But indirectly, actually more than people think. Because this is the first war, in which war crimes issues have arisen from the very beginning. It's a world in which we live in now, in which open source intelligence is freely available. You know, there are a world of people out there who are digging through images, who know quite a lot, who can do forensics, the satellite imagery. I mean, any intelligence chief will tell you, any British intelligence chief will tell you quite openly that more than 90%, in some cases 95%, of everything they deal with is open source intelligence. The 5% that's really secret is gold dust. And that's the 5%. But the vast majority is open source. And what we've got here, I mean, as you know, the report was, we've been looking at what happened on Jablonska Street in Bucha. Those are the bodies in that street. And the Russians insisted that those bodies were put there after they left on the 30th to the 31st of March. But now Maxar have produced an image which shows what appear to be exactly the same bodies, in exactly the same place, exactly referenced by the things next to them and the shadows that they create. And the Maxar image is the 19th of March. So it's pretty conclusive that those bodies have been lying there since at least the 19th of March. And then the Ukrainians did something very interesting yesterday. They issued a list which they said they had captured of the 64th Motor Rifle Brigade, who were the last unit to leave Bucha. And that list was names, ranks and passport numbers of a great many of those troops. And so they were saying, look, if this constitute war crimes, then there are people in this brigade, this motor rifle brigade, who can be pinpointed. And so we can do more than you think because of open source intelligence to make it clear to Russian soldiers that the Nuremberg tradition applies. That is to say, I was only obeying orders is no defence.
And it's part of the Russian tactics, though, to continue to deny this reality. You know, we've heard it there at the United Nations. We heard it from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, yesterday. We've heard it in Syria. We've heard it in Salisbury. It's a tactic, isn't it?
They do. They always go through three stages. First of all, they deny it outright. Just ridiculous. Don't be foolish. Then they start to obfuscate. So they create lots of complications. Oh, well, there might have been this and it might have been that, and look at what else was happening at the time. And they create new stuff that seems to make it very complicated, so no simple picture could really emerge. And then a couple of years later, they admit it. In the face of all the evidence, they said, yes, we did do it, but you do it as well. And they try to create moral equivalence to say, look, this is the world, this is cynicism, this is the world we live in. And so it goes through denial, obfuscation, and then moral equivalence. It's a standard tactic, and they do it every time.
OK, let's get another question on the same subject. Tom asked this: what's the possibility of Russian forces being tried for war crimes, and how hard will it be to bring Vladimir Putin to justice? Well, you kind of addressed the first part of that question already, Michael. There have been some of the forces personally identified who are in the region and certainly would face questions. But what about tracing it all the way, the chain of command, all the way to the top?
Quite difficult, of course, but the indictment as a war criminal is something that hangs on leaders. And in Vladimir Putin's case, this is a real big one, because previous leaders who've been indicted have been from fairly small countries who've committed atrocities in Africa, mainly, and in former Yugoslavia. This is, of course, the biggest case ever. And if Putin, in a sense, is indicted, then that will send a message to a lot of other dictators around the globe. Will he ever appear in front of a war crimes tribunal? Only if he falls and is handed over by some sort of future government of Russia. That's quite hard to imagine. But living under the shadow of a war crimes indictment would mean that, in theory, if he travelled to any of the countries that are signatories to the International Criminal Court, he could be arrested, which is actually quite an interesting impression to put himself under.
But does, in the reality of the situation, does it make a peace deal more difficult in that if you're saying, right, we're going to arrest you if you so much as put a foot outside Russian territory?
It might. That's what we used to say about Saddam Hussein, that the more we demonise him, the harder it will be for him to back down. The argument against that is that Putin has already crossed his Rubicon. You know, he's burned so many bridges behind him. He can only go forward, and he will continue to do that. And that trying to negotiate with this man, is the argument, is now too difficult, and we've got to actually stand up for what is basically right and decent and civilised. That's the counter-argument. Although there are downsides to going through this process of legalising everything, the upside is just too big, and we've got to grasp the upside, because this is the struggle of our era. This is the struggle that will define us for the next 50 years in Europe.
OK, well, let's stay with that issue. This from Will. Is it a deliberate act of Russian military policy to intimidate civilians, or evidence of a breakdown in military discipline and morale? Well, we mentioned their previous incidents of it. Do you tend towards the former?
It's probably both. I mean, there are deliberate acts of military policy. We know that the Rosgvardia, who are the internal troops, who are there, they're the enforcement troops, the police, who've been brought in on the back of the military force themselves. They don't fight, but they work through the civilians. They actually keep order. And we know that the Rosgvardia have lists of people that they intended to pick up. And we also know that where there has been some passive resistance, that the Russians have responded and they've retaliated. So a certain amount of this intimidation and abuse is probably deliberately retaliatory. Quite a lot of what we're seeing, I'm sure, is indiscipline, because the Russian forces have very weak non-commissioned officers. They're NCO cadre, the sergeants, the corporals, who are there to actually keep order among the troops, to make the troops behave properly and professionally, to drive them forward, to help them, to act as their mothers. You know, their NCO cadre is very poor. Always was in the Red Army, it is in this army.
But we know they had lists of people that when they take areas, they were going to round up.
That's right. Lists of people who were political activists, NGO people, politicians, journalists. I mean, British and American intelligence said that they know they have these lists. And when we looked at what happened in Kherson, which they did occupy, we saw those lists being carried through. We saw mayors of places being carted away and replaced with puppet mayors who were all ready to go. Some of that's been reversed now, but it's undoubtedly the Rosgvardia came in order to sort of Stalinize the areas that the Russians took over.
And in terms of that ill discipline, we've also seen images from Belarus where Russian forces, so many of them have withdrawn, 2 of them, in courier companies dispatching some of their looted goods back home.
And do you know what that tells us? That there is organised criminality right down to the lowest levels, because the Ukrainians have discovered, when they've captured tanks, sometimes they've found fridges inside, looted fridges, looted microwaves, and they've filled their tanks and their vehicles with all these household goods that they've looted. Now, they're not going to carry them all the way back to Russia in their tanks. So what are they doing? They're swapping that for cash quite close to where they looted it, and somebody else is then taking it to distribution centres, taking it into Belarus, into Russia, to sell it on the black market. What that tells us is that there is organised criminality right down to the unit level of these forces that have gone into Ukraine. It couldn't operate otherwise. Very organised process, which again tells us about the lack of discipline at the lower levels of the units.
Indeed. OK, this from Thomas. The United States has called for Russia to be kicked out of the UN Human Rights Council. Let's be clear, Human Rights Council. Can they be kicked out of the UN Security Council? Well, this was something Mark Stone was just addressing. Well, the UN Security Council, not as such, because they've got veto on the council.
Not a chance.
What about the UN Human Rights Council?
That's possible, and that would be entirely symbolic. You know, there are certain things the UN does well and certain things it doesn't do very well. And the Human Rights Council is one of those things it really doesn't do very well at all. Everyone is a member of the Council, and they have 47 members who rotate every 3 years as an executive. The present executive is led by an Argentinian, and they're there for the 2022 to 24 period. And sometimes the Human Rights Council comes up with the most egregious foolishness. I mean, the Chinese block any discussion of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. The Human Rights Council regularly goes after Israel on Palestinian issues, but won't talk about other things. The United States tries to protect Israel on the Human Rights Council. It is a bun fight, and to be honest, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with human rights. It's one of those areas of the UN machinery which is probably the most hypocritical. But to throw Russia out symbolically, it won't make any difference, except that it increases that sense of isolation that Russia under Putin does not belong in the civilised family of nations. That's the message.
But the door has to be kept open then. You say it's a symbol under Putin.
Yeah.
But do we have to say to Russia, look, well, you know, if this changes, you can...
Oh, for sure. I mean, the Western allies are very keen to say, look, we don't have a quarrel with the Russian people. The Russian people are, it's a great civilization. It's part of Europe and Asia. Our issue is with this man who has adopted the Stalinist mantle. And whilst Putin is in charge, we find we can't deal with you. Once he is not in charge, in whatever way in which he gives up power, we will be delighted to deal with Russia as we think it should be dealt with.
Let's get another question. You know, what more can be done to protect people? And Andy asked this. Is there any way United Nations peacekeepers could move into Ukraine to assist at least with humanitarian aid and UN peacekeepers drawn from forces around the world?
Yeah, they are. By and large, they say, well, you can't have UN peacekeepers until there's a peace to keep. But if there were ceasefires, then it's plausible, wouldn't be easy, but it's plausible that UN forces could actually try to... They can't keep the ceasefire, but they could actually operate humanitarian corridors. They could help deliver humanitarian aid. That's exactly what the British were doing through the UN in Yugoslavia in 1992. It was a UN, the UNPROFOR operation. But very quickly, of course, they found they were fighting. They were there just to deliver food. And, you know, talk to Bob Stewart now, who's Colonel Bob Stewart, who's an MP, Conservative MP. I mean, he led the, it was the Cheshire Regiment, I think it was, into former Yugoslavia. And within a couple of months, they were fighting. Because you can't deliver humanitarian aid in a volatile situation without having somehow to take sides in order to do your job. So it's not out of the question, but we'd have to be somewhere else in this war for it to become feasible, I would say. OK, Michael, we're going to pause it there and then get to many more questions. Just to let you know, you're watching a special question and answer programme on the war in Ukraine. Next, we're asking about the weather. Yes, it's very significant. Is Russia about to face what it has been avoiding all along?
The world seems to be becoming more and more divided. Issues around politics, culture, the pandemic are resulting in vastly opposing viewpoints, causing real rifts between us. I want to get in the middle of those debates. I want to better understand where each stance comes from and whether there's room for compromise. Join me, Trevor Phillips, as we look to find common ground on Sky News.
Yeah, I tried to do this basic. I couldn't work for the payslip. P45 on the late shift. Papa knows I can't afford to waste gifts. Had to justify the waiting. Reinvent yourself, amazing. You don't have to sign to make. All in your mind is undiscovered greatness. Oh. Sometimes it's shy, times hesitate to get involved.
We actually started this company to champion Black stories and Black talent, but also just tell diverse stories. So we're very, very happy that these films are showing this week. I grew up in an environment that I feel like had certain expectations of Black boys. The way that you had to carry yourself, the way that you had to communicate, the way that you had to dress. And I think a lot of it was survival mechanisms that lent into toxic masculinity. However, when I left this area and I went to university and I started working in the arts, I felt that I had to do the opposite. I almost had to code switch to make people that I was around feel comfortable and almost dispel the stereotype of Black boys and Black men that was in media. And so like, after that, I almost felt like I didn't fit into either of these worlds and none of them were a true representation of who I was. And so I wanted to make a film about that impasse of wherein you need to, that impasse of space wherein you need to decide who you want to be as a man. And so that's essentially what Butterfly Effect is about. Yeah, I mean, music videos were and have been an amazing, I guess, stomping ground to be able to cut my teeth in terms of direction and working with talent. And it's been amazing. I think like we've been able to create like a few moments that have lived on in the world of music videos, and hopefully they'll be joined by some narrative work that I'm going to do going forward as well.
Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight, and I'm with Professor Michael Clarke, and your questions about the war in Ukraine. Let's get our next one. This is from Robin. He's asking about the potential for Russia to look beyond Ukraine's borders and ask this: should we help fortify Odesa to stop Russia taking the strategic port city and gaining a land corridor in the south to Moldova? Well, Michael, first of all, you have to inform us about the geography. If that was the ambition, that would also cut Ukraine off from the sea.
Correct, yeah. I mean, Odesa is the main port onto the Black Sea, now that the Ukrainians lost Sevastopol, of course, when they lost the Crimea in 2014. So Odesa's the main port. The Russians looked as if they certainly wanted to take Odesa in the early stage of the war. We thought they would. They got held up at Mykolaiv, which is about 80 miles away, 80 miles to the east. They've been pushed back even from Mykolaiv, so they're now further away from Odesa than they were before. And it looked as if they had an amphibious landing capability as well. And what we thought was that they would move in on Odesa from the landward side once they'd taken Mykolaiv, and then their amphibious group would then go in with the land forces to support them. Just didn't happen. And, should we help fortify Odesa, says Robin? Absolutely, it's a good idea, because quite a lot of what we could give to the Ukrainians would make a difference in Odesa, because Odesa is quite a tough nut as a city to take, and it's a very tough nut of a city to assault from the sea. And so the Ukrainians have got their own Neptune anti-ship missiles, and they've been quite successful with at least one of their Neptunes recently. We might give them our Harpoon weapons. We have an anti-ship missile called Harpoon, which is pretty good. We've also got a thing called Sea Venom, which is launched from a Wildcat helicopter, and they're more agile because you can send them in a helicopter somewhere else before they launch. So there are things that we could do, and I know that Number 10 is very interested in seeing what might make a difference. But yes, I mean, Robin is absolutely right. Odessa is a big strategic issue. If the Russians can't take it, that represents quite a big failure in what they can achieve in Ukraine, and it's probably worth the Ukrainians putting a lot of effort in and us putting a lot of effort into helping them maintain it.
And Michael, I've just got a quick question then, if that is to happen, about lines of supply. If the fighting moves away from the north, moves away from Kiev, getting that weaponry to the Ukrainian forces is a far, far greater distance. Does that make them more vulnerable to attack?
Well, it might be easier if the lines of supply could go through Romania or even Moldova, which are right next door. I mean, Moldova is only 30 miles away. The Moldovan border is only 30 miles away from Odessa. So if we could use those routes, if those countries would let us, then supply would be easier. I was actually talking to an MOD official about a week ago, and we asked about the lines of supply. And he was actually surprisingly relaxed about it. He was saying, look, as long as these cities are open, like Kharkiv and Sumy, which they now are, he said, we can get stuff in. And I was really quite surprised, because I thought, well, there's some pretty big distances there. And I didn't press him, because I don't want to know. Well, I do want to know, but I shouldn't know. So I didn't press him, but he said, no, we can get stuff in. There are different ways of doing it, and we can keep the Ukrainians supplied, as long as we agree to do it and we do it with our allies.
That's very good to hear. Now, a question from Mervyn, and it's about conflict with Russia and the weather. How often does that pop up? Mervyn says, why have Russia invaded when the spring thaw brings mud that makes movement of mechanised armies very difficult, like those tanks? Good question, that, isn't it?
Very good question. I mean, that was why we all said, when we were thinking about this possibility back before the 24th of February, we said, and I said a few times on various programmes, the window of opportunity for the Russians will go from about early February to about mid to late March, because then the ground will get soft and armoured vehicles will find it much more difficult to move over soft ground. And the weather forecast, I checked on the weather this week in Ukraine, and Monday was a pretty cold day, so it's still only 8 or 9 degrees, both in Kiev and in Mykolaiv in the south, a bit warmer in Odessa. But this week, here we are on, Tuesday, by the end of this week, it'll be 18 or 19 degrees throughout Ukraine with rain. And so the weather is warming up, the spring rains are coming, the ground is softening. And the Russians, of course, expected to have all this over by the 8th of March. Their original plan was 3 days to take Kiev, and then mopping up operations in other cities, which would be really glad to see them, by the 8th of March. So here they are. Today is day 40 of the war, the 40th day of the war, and the weather, as it improves, will turn against what they are trying to do, which is use heavy armour in rapid movements, trying to envelop the Ukrainian army and so on. The Ukrainians will have the easier job because they dug in, And if they can hold their current positions, they don't have to fight a war of manoeuvre to quite the same extent in the southeast. But if the Russians are to succeed, they've got to manoeuvre an awful lot better than they have so far, and the weather is against them. Mervyn's absolutely right.
Yeah, well, I mentioned the weather and conflicts with Russia. I mean, could in a way, I mean, it's a long way off and in very different weather conditions. Yeah. You know, we've all read about what happened to Napoleon's armies in the winter.
And to Hitler.
Hitler's armies in the winter.
The Russian winter.
This is the spring, the weather doing to the Russians what previously it's done to their enemies.
Yeah. You know, I mean, battles and warfare is so much about the conditions. So much about the conditions. And, you know, at sea, they always say that the issue of sea power is about coping with the sea. The enemy are just another damn nuisance. You know, the issue is coping with the sea. And so much of military success is dealing with the conditions.
And the conditions changing there. And thank you very much indeed for casting your eye over the Ukrainian weather forecast, as we would expect, Michael, of course. We're taking another break. You're watching a special question and answer programme on the war in Ukraine. Next, we're asking, how long can the Russians last in Ukraine? And could the Ukrainians start striking back into Russia itself? Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm with Professor Michael Clarke and your questions on the war in Ukraine. Let's get one from Alan now about armour. We were just before the break discussing tanks and their manoeuvrability in the weather conditions. Alan asks, how much more ammunition and firepower has Russia got left to continue its invasion? Well, we've been seeing long lists of what the Ukrainians have destroyed. What have they got left?
Yes, I mean, the Russians have lost at least 2,100 pieces of significant equipment, and the Ukrainians have lost about 600. 650. So the Russians have lost 3 or 4 times what the Ukrainians have lost. But the Russians have huge stocks, of course. And there are all sorts of stories about they're getting some of the older tanks out of the stock and so on. What's interesting, I think, about Alan's question is that the Russians have got any amount of old Cold War stuff. So they've got their howitzers, their self-propelled howitzers, their towed artillery, and they've got any number of shells 20 years, 30 years old to fire on them. What they look to be short of is modern missiles. And they've fired well over 1,000 missiles, and it looks as if they are running short of them because they haven't fired as many recently. And we think that that's one of the things that they asked the Chinese for when they went to the Chinese and said, we need more ammunition. There's another element here, which is that because they expected to take over Ukraine quickly, they thought that they would take over Kharkiv and Izium really quickly. Now, they haven't got either of those cities, and Izium is where the Ukrainians are fighting really hard.
Where's Izium?
Izium is in the Donbass region.
Right.
It's the Ukrainian headquarters, really, in the Donbass. And Kharkiv and Izium is the place where they make all the motors, the engines, for Russian missiles, Russian tanks, Russian ships. So their engine factories are in Ukraine, most of them. And so the Russians had to conquer those cities in order to get hold of the engines that they need for their new production of missiles. And so one of the things that's problematical for them is that they can't ramp up quickly enough to produce the stuff that they need in the high-tech area. So, yeah, they've got any amount of old-fashioned stuff. They can pound cities to rubble with Cold War artillery. But if we're talking about modern missiles, they're stuck.
That's astonishing about Izium. I did not know that. Michael, thank you. Well, this is about the Ukrainian side of the equation. Then why isn't Ukraine bombing or targeting missile strikes on parts of Russia as both countries are at war with each other? That's from Sarah. Well, it goes without saying, a massive country. But, I mean, would Ukraine have the capability to actually physically attack Russian territory?
No, I mean, not in any significant degree. There were reports of what might have been a false flag attack on oil storage just over the Russian border a few days ago, and the Ukrainians said it wasn't them, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But there's no real military logic, because the Ukrainians would have to attack so deep into Russian territory to get the air bases, to get the storage bases, to actually do any damage to the forward positions that the Russians are taking, that they just can't do it. And what they would do, by extending the war that way, they risk losing some of the enormous support they've got in the rest of the world. They are fighting a brilliant defensive war, and while they're clearly on the defensive and doing so well, their best strategy is to kind of chew up the Russian forces as they come at them, rather than do what a more modern military would do, which is to get at the rear areas and interrupt the flow. They can't do it, and
But in the main, it's the signalling, isn't it? Saying, you invaded us, and you must leave our country. We're no threat to you.
Exactly, and that's a really important message that Zelensky has been putting. He said, get your troops out of my country, and then we can talk about all sorts of things. But why would I talk when you've invaded me? And I've never been a threat to you, we've never been a threat to you, and we never would be. How could we be? We're a small country. We're a big country in Europe, but we are a third of the size of you. We are Little Russia. That's what you used to call us. I mean, there's no way we could ever attack you, is the argument.
Well, here's another question about Russian forces, and we've been hearing for some time about mercenaries, haven't we? Is there any evidence of mercenaries fighting in Ukraine? Mick asks that. Well, on both sides. Well, we've heard about foreign legions joining the Ukrainian side, but what about the Russians? We know about this mysterious Wagner group.
The Wagner group are there. At least 1,000 of them have come back from Africa, and they are, they're a private security company. They are battle-trained. They're very hard people. They've committed all sorts of acts in Africa. And so there's about 1,000 of them believed to be there. The Chechens are there as well. And the Chechens are fighting in Mariupol, and again, reasonably effectively. There's no evidence yet that some of these African groups have turned up, or the Syrian groups. There's even rumours that the Syrians have gone home. And one of the things you have to realise about some of these African and Syrian groups, some of them are not fighters at all. I mean, the Wagner group are all professional hitmen, really. But some of these Syrians are young lads who sign up for the money. They're offered a lot of money to join a unit, to go to fight. They don't care what they're fighting for, and they're sending the money back home. It's a classic case. the thing about all of these groups is that although some of them, like the Chechens and the Wagner group, are effective if they attack a village because they're experienced fighters and they're very well armed and so on, but they can't fit in to a combined arms arrangement. They can't actually plug in to a sophisticated military. They can just act as a local militia, and in many cases thugs, in one given area. It's not that they don't make a difference, but they don't ever really make a strategic difference if you're talking about more organised forces.
Interesting. You mentioned strategic difference. Well, let's address an area that really is making that. This from Hader. Will NATO advisors be helping Ukrainians plan attacks against Russians with information from Western intelligence? Well, how much can you tell us?
Oh, well, the answer is for sure. Because Western intelligence have been helping the Ukrainians as much as possible. Before the war broke out, before the 24th of February, we had British rivet joint aircraft, I was called rivet joints, that kept at Waddington. And whether they were flying from Waddington or from Akrotiri in Cyprus, I'm not certain. But we had rivet joint aircraft. And again, you could go onto public tracing apps and see where these aircraft were going. And they were going up and down the border between Ukraine and Belarus, with Ukrainians' full support, of course, listening in. They're intelligence-gathering aircraft. And they were listening in to conversations, listening in to...
And can they cover most of Ukraine then from that border?
Totally, yeah. And since the war started, not only of rivet joint, but all NATO aircraft and Swedish aircraft, who are not members of NATO, have been going up and down the border, listening to gather as much intelligence. And I can promise you, we are giving everything we can that we think is useful to the Ukrainians.
And one imagines satellite imagery as well.
Everything. Everything. I mean, without revealing sources, I mean, the essence of intelligence is never, ever reveal your sources. That's the fundamental principle. You know, you would take a lot of hits before you reveal your source. So anything you give to an ally, never, ever reveal your source. So we certainly won't be doing that, but we'd be giving them everything that can make a difference to the battlefield that they have to inhabit. Yeah.
Short of troops, of course.
Yeah.
Well, here's the question that don't know, it kind of looms behind this entire conflict, doesn't it, from Johnny? If Putin decides to use nuclear weapons, how long would it take for them to launch? Would we have any indication of the process? What do you know about the launch procedures?
Yeah, for the Russians, it depends what sort of nuclear weapons you're talking about. If we were talking, as I think we've mentioned before, that if we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, the sort that if we got into this issue, and we're a long, long way from nuclear use at the moment, but we're in a war and things change quickly, or can. If we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, that is ones that the Russians would use on the battlefield in relatively small explosions, then yes, there'd be quite a lot of indications. You could see them being brought forward. I mean, nuclear arms are not like any other ammunition. You don't just stick them on the back of a truck. So we would see Western intelligence is looking very carefully for any indications of this. We would see those munitions being brought forward, and we'd see the sort of dual-use artillery that could fire them, or could aircraft that might deliver them. So yes, there would be plenty of indication of that. Okay. If we were talking about strategic nuclear weapons, then Mr. Putin has an ability to communicate directly with his submarine commanders, and that would be a relatively quick process that would give no warning, unless it was politically warned, unless there was a series of political statements. So it would depend on which nuclear weapons.
What about on our side?
On our side, it's quite different in the sense that all nuclear submarines, British nuclear submarines, they carry a letter from the Prime Minister, the famous letter of last resort. So if all else fails, if you've got no contact with the outside world and you think a nuclear attack may have taken place, you open the letter, which is kept in a little cabinet in the submarine. In fact, there's a First Sea Lords letter in there as well. So what the captain has to do is open the First Sea Lords letter, which tells him something, and then open the Prime Minister's letter, which may say the same, or whatever. So there's these letters of last resort. But that's in this bizarre situation where a submarine commander may think that the rest of the world has gone crazy and that commander's got to make his own decisions. In the more normal situation, Prime Minister is on a visit to Darlington, and there's an issue, and the Prime Minister says, right, OK, I have to launch nuclear weapons. The Prime Minister's authorisation is at once, I'm told, and I don't know what this is, of course, but the Prime Minister's authorisation is unbreakable but completely secure. It's not a set of digits or a set of numbers. It's something that only that Prime Minister can do, or somebody who is standing in for the Prime Minister because the Prime Minister's having an operation on his heart or her heart or whatever it is. And so the Prime Minister's authorisation goes to the Ministry of Defence, into the bunker underneath the Ministry of Defence. That then goes to Fleet Headquarters at Northwood, and at Northwood, they contact the submarine. In the submarine, the captain and the executive officer open the codes. They have to stand a long way apart, and they have to both turn a key. And they both have to turn this key within a couple of seconds. So not one person can't do it. Both of them have to do it long distance apart from each other. And that arms the weapon. And it isn't a button, it is a pistol grip. And so when the weapon is armed, the captain then picks up the pistol grip, do the countdown, presses the pistol grip, and the weapon's launched. How long does it take? 55 minutes.
Not really an instant.
And everything I've said is in the public domain, I hasten to add.
Indeed.
It's in the public domain. You
I mean,
can read it.
fascinating, Michael, but of course entirely chilling. We're going to take another break. I think we need one after that. You're watching a special question and answer programme on the war in Ukraine. Next, we are asking, could Ukraine sue for peace and on what terms? And also, can Putin hold on to power? We'll be addressing those issues next.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
It's going to become very similar to other places and lose its unique qualities.
It's steeped in history.
If the Taliban found your family, what would happen?
I think they're just going to straight away execute them.
There are issues of racism in all levels of cricket.
I was on the balcony a couple of times. I was nearly gone.
Football is a joy to watch, and when people are disappointed, you can feel the hate.
I just felt physically sick, so I was like, that's really in my system.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. Even before the pandemic, GPs were pleading for help. Government expects more face-to-face contact with patients in return.
Men, they want to force you doing something which you don't want to do, just because you're homeless and you're looking for a warm place to sleep.
We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Well, welcome back. I'm with Professor Michael Clarke and your questions on the war in Ukraine. Let's put Jeremy's question to Michael here. He says Russia celebrates... Russia says it is denazifying Russia. Could a major assault be ahead to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany on the 9th of May? And this has been much speculated about, Michael, isn't it, that somehow President Putin wants some kind of victory to parade in Red Square on May the 9th.
Yes, May the 9th is Victory Day, always has been. I mean, the Second World War ended on May the 8th, 1945, and so May the 9th is a very important celebration in Russia, and always has been. And British and American intelligence are saying they are convinced, again, this is intelligence people speaking, that Putin is now taking this very seriously. And so that kind of gives us a sense that this offensive in the Donbass, which is developing quite quickly, is probably designed to try to produce something in the week before the 9th of May. But here we are on the 4th, 5th of April. There's about 3 weeks. So we might be facing a rather intensive battle over 3 weeks so that Mr. Putin can say, I've got the whole of the Donbass back. I personally think he'd be lucky to do it, but I think that's what he may want to say. But the interesting thing is this denazification thing. Yeah. It's gone to ridiculous lengths now, because his argument is not just that the government of Ukraine are Nazis, the whole society are Nazis. There was an article appeared in the Novosti, the RIA Novosti news agency yesterday, which is the state news agency, and it was an op-ed piece, and it said that Ukrainians, again, don't exist. They just created themselves out of the little Russia that used to exist and the Nouveau Russia of Catherine the Great. And it said that the process of denazification will have to coincide with the process of de-Ukrainianization. And this article was the closest I have ever seen in a newspaper that justified genocide. Absolutely astonishing. And that doesn't appear, although it appeared under a different name, it doesn't appear unless the Kremlin approves it. And so the Russians are clearly flying a kite for a maximalist position, which is to say that the whole of Ukraine has to be denazified.
And tying it in with that defeat of it.
Exactly. It's bizarre in the sense that the war, from Putin's point of view, the reality of the war is getting smaller and smaller. His aims are becoming smaller, but his political aims are bigger and bigger all the time, which is why I worry, I'm haunted by the fact, or the idea, that this may become a more general European war before it's all over.
OK, well, let's talk about peace instead of expansion of the war. Nick asks this. What terms can Ukraine realistically agree to that would be sufficient to stop the fighting? Well, it's the eternal question, and of course, it's up to the Ukrainians.
Of course, yeah, we have to back whatever their judgment is. And my guess is, again, Zelensky has been very clever. He said, look, we can talk about neutrality, we can talk about NATO, we can talk about the EU, we can talk about the status of Ukraine afterwards, of course, but you've got to get out of my country first. I'm not going to talk when you're occupying territory of mine or of our country. Now, I think that Zelensky understands that he's probably lost Crimea forever, because they lost Crimea in 2014, very important part of Ukraine, but it is 90% Russian. It is Russian. It is thoroughly Russian in culture and outlook. And I don't think Ukraine, in a way, would want Crimea back, because it would have to struggle to maintain control if it ever did. So my own view is that Zelensky could say, look, I'm making a huge concession here. Ukraine's a very important piece of territory, very important place, historically,
Crimea, yeah.
culturally, yeah. If I agree that you keep Ukraine, then you've got to get out of the rest. And that might be a feasible negotiating position if the Russians continue to do badly. But for Putin, that would represent real failure, because it would mean that he ended the war with less than he started with in territorial terms. And remember, Putin only seems to think about power in territorial terms. So in his one-dimensional world, that would be real failure, and he'd have to live with that.
OK, well, let's stay with some kind of end game to this war. And Martin asks this, given the destruction, I mean, billions upon billions, hundreds of billions of dollars we've witnessed even so far, can the Russian financial assets held by the West be seized and used to repair the damage and rebuild Ukraine? Some kind of reparations?
For sure. I mean, in theory, yes. I mean, the Russians began this war with a kind of war chest. So they had foreign reserves of $630 billion, which is a pretty big war chest. They found within the first week of the war that half of them, 315, I think it was, $billion worth, had been impounded, had been frozen in the West. So they've lost half of their war reserve at a stroke of a pen, because they didn't believe that the West would react as strongly as the West did. That 300 odd that they've still got is enough to keep going, and they're still getting the money in for their energy exports, their gas and their oil, less for their coal these days, and they won't get much for their coal at all soon. So they can keep financing the war. But yes, the West holds at least $300 billion worth of dollars of Russian money that could well become reparations if there was some sort of settlement in which the Russians admitted that they were wrong. They admitted that, we'd have to be post-Putin. We'd have to be talking about a Russia after Putin for that to happen.
That's the question we want to put lastly, Michael. Thank you for anticipating that. This from Mike. Do you think that Vladimir Putin could hold on to power directly or indirectly? What are the chances of him being ousted? Hold on to power directly or indirectly? I mean, he's certainly not going to go voluntarily.
No. And he never was. I mean, we were saying 5 years ago, we said, look, there's no peaceful transfer of power that we can imagine in Russia. Once he gave himself power to stay in office until 2036, we began to call him Vladimir the Indefinite. We just didn't know how this could end well. I'm on record as saying I think he will go. I think he will go maybe quite quickly or maybe in 2 or 3 years because he's leading Russia into a complete wilderness internationally. And I think the longer he stays, the more Russia will be on its knees economically by the time he does go. But
what happens then? Let's follow that scenario through. Do you get more Putin? Do you get a proper Democrat? Or do you get civil war? Do you get Russia breaking up?
Yeah. All of those things are plausible. My guess is you won't get a nice person after Putin. You might get a Putin 2 who then sees the reality of having to rehabilitate Russia within the international community. And then Putin 3, or the next generation of leader, might then be someone that you could deal with more reasonably. But it will be a difficult transition process. But I do think that's what we will come to. I do think that's where we will end up. Putin, I'm happy to say live on TV, I do not believe he will last into the 2030s. I'm sure he won't.
A note to end it on. Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Professor Michael Clarke answering your questions brilliantly on the war in Ukraine. And you're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up in the next hour, well, we're going to have the latest on those alleged war crimes being committed by Russia in Ukraine. President Zelensky directly addressed the United Nations today about that. We'll have full analysis.
They're images that have shocked the world. The Ukrainian government says they show evidence of war crimes by Russian forces, and Vladimir Putin must be held accountable. Russia claims the pictures and video are fake. What happens now? Well, on Thursday, I'll be speaking to one of Putin's closest advisors, his press secretary, Dmitry Peskov. Watch The View from the Kremlin, Putin's spokesman, live at 5 p.m. on Thursday.